The elevator doors were closing when Ethan Miller heard heels striking marble like gunshots. He didn't turn around. His worn suit jacket hung loose on shoulders that had carried too much for too long, and his thumb pressed the lobby button with the quiet finality of a man who knew how this story ended. 30 seconds ago, he'd sat in a conference room surrounded by executives in suits worth more than his car. They asked one question. He gave one answer. The rejection landed before he finished his sentence. Now the fluorescent lights of the elevator hummed against the silence, and Ethan watched the numbers descend, floor by floor, dream by dream. Then a voice pierced through the closing gap. "Mr. Miller, wait!" The most powerful woman in the building was running toward him, her hand catching the steel doors, her breath uneven. Victoria Hale had just ended his career. So why did she look like she was the one who'd lost something? The steel doors shuddered and reopened. Victoria Hale stood in the gap, her palm flat against the cold metal, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm that didn't belong to a woman who owned half the commercial real estate in 3 states. Her pearl earrings caught the fluorescent light. Her charcoal blazer cost more than Ethan's monthly rent. But her eyes, those calculating boardroom eyes that had dismissed him minutes ago, now held something he couldn't name. Ethan's finger hovered over the close button. He had $47 in his checking account, a daughter waiting at the bus stop in 2 hours, and absolutely no reason to stand here listening to whatever speech came next. The rejection still echoed in his skull, the pity in her voice when she'd said, "We'll be in touch," while everyone in the room knew they wouldn't. He'd heard that tone before, from landlords and loan officers, and every person who'd ever looked at his resume and seen the 4-year gap like a crater. "I don't need an explanation," Ethan said. His voice came out flatter than he intended, scraped clean of the politeness he'd worn like armor through the interview. "I understood the first time." He moved to press the button again, but Victoria stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut behind her with a soft hiss, sealing them both inside the descending box. She stood too close. He could smell her perfume, something expensive, something that reminded him of the life he'd almost had before everything fell apart. The numbers above the door ticked down. 42, 41, 40. Neither of them spoke. Victoria's hand trembled slightly at her side, and Ethan found himself staring at it, despite himself. He'd never seen a billionaire's hand shake before. He'd assumed they were born steady, their confidence coded into their DNA alongside their trust funds. "That question," Victoria finally said. Her voice had lost its conference room polish. The one about choosing between your daughter and the overseas assignment. Ethan's jaw tightened. Of course she wanted to talk about that. The question had been a trap, and he'd walked into it with his eyes open, knowing exactly what his answer would cost him. The panel of executives had exchanged glances when he spoke, those quick, judgmental flickers that said everything their mouths didn't. One of them had actually written something on his notepad. Ethan imagined it said, "not committed," or "liability," or simply "no." But he'd told the truth anyway, because Lucy deserved a father who told the truth, even when the truth was expensive. "What about it?" he asked. The elevator passed the 30th floor. 29 more to go. 29 more floors of whatever this was. Victoria turned to face him fully. In her heels, she was nearly his height, and her gaze met his without flinching. "You answered in 4 seconds, she said. I counted. 4 seconds. No hesitation. No attempt to negotiate or reframe, or give us the answer we obviously wanted. Her voice cracked on the last word, just barely, like ice beginning to split. "Do you have any idea how rare that is?" Ethan didn't know how to respond. He'd expected her to defend the rejection, to explain corporate policy or travel requirements, or whatever justification executives use to sleep at night after crushing someone's last hope. He hadn't expected this, whatever this was. The elevator passed the 20th floor, The silence stretched between them, filled only by the mechanical hum of cables and counterweights. Victoria's hand had stopped trembling. Now she pressed it flat against her stomach, like she was holding something in. "I was supposed to let you walk away," she said quietly. The interview was over. The decision was made. Every protocol I've built over 15 years told me to let those doors close and move on to the next candidate. She paused. The number above the door read 15. "But I couldn't stop thinking about the way you said it. My daughter only has me." Like it was the simplest thing in the world. Like there was no other possible answer. Ethan felt something shift in his chest. Not hope, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something dangerous. He'd learned a long time ago not to trust moments like this. People said things they didn't mean. They made promises that dissolved in daylight. He'd buried his wife with a church full of people swearing they'd help, and within 6 months, he couldn't get any of them to return a phone call. The elevator reached the lobby with a soft chime. The doors opened onto marble floors, and morning sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. A security guard glanced up from his desk. A woman in a red dress hurried past with a coffee cup. The ordinary world waited just beyond the threshold, ready to swallow Ethan back into its indifferent machinery. But Victoria didn't move, and because she didn't move, neither did he. "I need to pick up my daughter," Ethan said. It wasn't an excuse, it was simply true. Lucy's bus would arrive at 3:45, and she'd stand at the corner with her purple backpack, looking for his face in the crowd of parents. She was 6 years old, and she'd already learned that sometimes the people you love don't come back. He refused to teach her that lesson twice. "I know," Victoria said. "I know exactly what it means to have a child waiting." She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a business card. Not the glossy corporate kind they'd given him at reception. This one was simpler, cream-colored, with just a name and a phone number handwritten in blue ink. "I'm asking for 1 hour, tomorrow. Not an interview, just a conversation." Ethan looked at the card in her extended hand. Her nails were painted a neutral color, perfectly manicured, but he noticed a small chip on her index finger. A tiny imperfection on an otherwise flawless surface. "Why?" he asked. "You already rejected me." Your whole panel agreed. I saw it on their faces. Victoria's expression flickered, something that might have been shame, or regret, or simply exhaustion. "Because 23 years ago, someone asked me the same question you got asked today, and I gave the opposite answer." She pressed the card into his palm before he could respond. Her fingers were cold against his skin. 1 hour, Mr. Miller. I'll explain everything." Then she stepped out of the elevator and walked away, her heels striking marble like the final notes of a song he didn't yet understand. Ethan stood there long after she disappeared into a private corridor, the business card growing warm in his grip. The doors tried to close. He let them. 4 years ago, Ethan Miller had been someone else entirely. He'd worn suits that fit properly and driven a car that didn't make concerning noises on cold mornings. He'd been a senior project manager at a tech firm downtown, the kind of man who answered emails at midnight and volunteered for every business trip because advancement required sacrifice, and sacrifice required presence. His wife, Celia, used to joke that his calendar was his mistress. He'd laughed at the time. He didn't laugh anymore. Celia had been diagnosed on a Tuesday in October. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, discovered too late because she'd been too busy being a mother and a wife and a part-time kindergarten teacher to notice the weight loss and the fatigue. The doctors gave her 8 months. She lasted 6. Those 6 months existed in Ethan's memory, like photographs left out in the rain. Images he could barely recognize, colors bleeding into each other. He remembered the hospital room. All was too cold. He remembered Lucy's confusion, her inability to understand why Mommy slept so much, why Mommy's hair was gone, why Mommy sometimes cried when she thought no one was watching. He remembered the morning Celia died. A Thursday. Lucy had been at school, mercifully spared from witnessing the final hours. Ethan had held his wife's hand while the monitors slowed, while her breath grew shallow, while the woman who'd taught him how to love disappeared somewhere he couldn't follow. The last thing she said was Lucy's name. Not his. Not goodbye. Just Lucy, spoken like a prayer, like a promise he was supposed to keep. Ethan had kept it. He'd quit his job 2 weeks after the funeral, ignoring his manager's protests and his colleagues' bewildered expressions. He'd cashed out his retirement account to pay for the medical bills insurance wouldn't cover. He'd sold the house in the suburbs and moved into a 2-bedroom apartment closer to Lucy's school, a place with thin walls and neighbors who argued at 2 a.m. But it was his, and it was close, and it meant he could walk Lucy to the bus stop every morning and be there when she got home every afternoon. For 4 years, Ethan had been a full-time father, and nothing else. He'd learned to braid hair by watching tutorials at midnight. He'd memorized the names of cartoon characters and the rules of playground games that made no logical sense. He'd attended every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every birthday party for children whose parents barely acknowledged him. The lone father among the mothers, the widower no one knew how to talk to. Lucy had nightmares for the first year. She'd crawl into his bed at 3 a.m, her small body trembling, and whisper questions he couldn't answer. Where did Mommy go? Why did she leave? Is she coming back? Ethan never lied to her. He told her the truth as gently as he could, that Mommy had been sick, that the sickness took her to a place where she couldn't hurt anymore, that she loved Lucy more than anything in the whole world and would always be watching over her. He didn't know if any of it was true. He said it anyway. The money ran out slowly, then quickly. Ethan picked up freelance work where he could, small consulting projects, website updates for local businesses, anything that could be done from home while Lucy slept. But freelance work was inconsistent, and his skills had aged 4 years without the industry moving alongside them. The tech world didn't wait for grieving fathers. It evolved and adapted, and left behind anyone who stepped off the treadmill for even a moment. By the time Lucy started first grade, Ethan knew he had to go back to work properly. Not freelance scraps and part-time gigs, but a real job with benefits and stability, and a future that didn't involve counting pennies at the grocery store. He updated his resume. He practiced interview answers in front of the bathroom mirror. He bought the cheapest suit he could find at a thrift store. Charcoal gray, slightly too big in the shoulders, but professional enough to pass. Then he started applying. The rejections came in waves. Some were form letters, generic and impersonal. Others were phone calls that began with, "We really enjoyed meeting you, but," followed by silence that said everything the words didn't. Hiring managers looked at his resume and saw the gap. 4 years of nothing. 4 years of being invisible to the professional world. They asked about it, of course. What had he been doing? Why had he left his previous position? Was he sure he was ready to commit to a demanding role? Ethan told them the truth. He'd been raising his daughter alone after his wife died. The interviewers would nod sympathetically, their faces arranging themselves into masks of understanding. Then they'd move on to the next question, and Ethan would watch them mentally cross his name off their lists. Hale Industries was supposed to be his last attempt. He'd found the listing online. A project management position, mid-level, nothing glamorous but enough to pay rent and buy groceries, and maybe save a little for Lucy's future. The requirements matched his experience almost perfectly. He'd spent 3 days preparing, researching the company, practicing answers to every question he could imagine. He'd even gotten his suit dry cleaned, spending money he didn't really have because first impressions mattered, and his confidence needed all the help it could get. The interview had gone well, he thought. The panel asked about his technical skills, his management philosophy, his approach to team dynamics. He answered clearly and competently, drawing on memories of projects he'd led years ago, hoping they couldn't see how much he needed this. Then came the final question. Mr. Miller, we're a global company. Our project managers frequently travel overseas for extended periods, sometimes 3 months or longer. The woman who spoke was Victoria Hale herself, though Ethan hadn't recognized her at the time. She'd been sitting at the head of the table, her face unreadable, her pen tapping a silent rhythm against her notepad. If a critical project required you to be in Singapore for 3 months, but your daughter was experiencing a psychological crisis at home, what would you do? The question hung in the air like smoke. Ethan felt the other executives watching him, waiting for the correct answer. The answer that prioritized the company. The answer that proved he was willing to sacrifice everything for the job. He thought about Celia. He thought about Lucy's nightmares. He thought about the promise he'd made at his wife's grave, when the flowers were still fresh and the dirt hadn't settled. "I'd stay with my daughter," he said. No hesitation, no qualification, just truth. The silence that followed was absolute. One of the executives, a man with silver hair and a watch worth more than Ethan's car, actually leaned back in his chair like Ethan had said something offensive. Victoria Hale's pen stopped tapping. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. "My daughter has already lost her mother," Ethan continued, because he was already finished anyway, so he might as well finish completely. "She's 6 years old, and she only has me. No grandparents, no aunts and uncles, no backup plan. If she needed me, truly needed me, no project in the world would be more important than being there." He'd expected arguments, counterpoints, the "what if we found a compromise" negotiation that interviews always devolved into. Instead, Victoria had simply nodded once, written something on her notepad, and said, "Thank you, Mr. Miller. We'll be in touch." The dismissal in her voice was unmistakable. The next morning, Ethan dropped Lucy at the bus stop and watched her climb the steps with her purple backpack bouncing against her small shoulders. She turned and waved at him through the window, her gap-toothed smile visible even from a distance. He waved back until the bus disappeared around the corner. Then he walked to the coffee shop 3 blocks from his apartment, the cheap one, where a small black coffee cost $2, and they let him sit for hours without buying anything else. Victoria's business card sat in his wallet, next to the photo of Celia he'd carried since her funeral. He'd looked at it 12 times since yesterday, turning it over, studying the handwritten number like it contained some hidden message. 1 hour, not an interview, just a conversation. He should throw it away. Nothing good came from rich people making promises to poor people. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, from the friends who'd abandoned him after Celia died, from the family who'd offered condolences but never help, from a society that celebrated parenthood in theory but punished it in practice. Victoria Hale had rejected him. She'd sat in that conference room and listened to his answer and decided he wasn't worth the risk. Whatever guilt or curiosity had driven her to chase him into the elevator didn't change the fundamental calculus. He was a single father with a gap in his resume and a daughter who needed him. She was a billionaire with a corporation to run and shareholders to satisfy. Their worlds didn't intersect, but he thought about the way her hand had trembled. He thought about her voice cracking when she said, "I gave the opposite answer." He thought about the chip in her nail polish, that small imperfection that suggested she was human underneath the armor. And despite every instinct telling him to walk away, Ethan pulled out his phone and dialed the number. Victoria answered on the second ring. "Mr. Miller." Her voice was different than yesterday, softer, stripped of its professional polish. "I wasn't sure you'd call." Ethan stared at his coffee, at the steam rising in slow spirals. "I almost didn't. I still might hang up." A pause. He heard her breathing on the other end of the line, steady and measured. "Then I'll talk fast. Can you meet me at the Whitmore Foundation building on 5th Street? Tomorrow at 10? It's not Hale Industries. It's personal. Personal. The word felt dangerous. Why should I trust you? Ethan asked. You already showed me what you think of my choices. Because I'm going to tell you about my son, Victoria said quietly. And maybe then you'll understand why I ran after you like a crazy person instead of letting you disappear. Her son. Ethan hadn't known she had a child. The corporate profiles and magazine interviews he'd read during his research never mentioned family, only acquisitions and quarterly profits and the various boards she sat on. 10 o'clock, he said finally. I'll give you 1 hour. But I'm not making any promises. Neither am I, Victoria said. That's not why I'm asking. She hung up before he could respond. The Whitmore Foundation occupied a brownstone building that looked nothing like Hale Industries' glass tower. Ivy climbed the brick walls. A small garden bloomed in the front yard, tended by someone who clearly loved flowers more than efficiency. Ethan arrived 15 minutes early and stood on the sidewalk, feeling distinctly out of place in his thrift store suit among the quiet elegance. Victoria met him at the front door. She wasn't dressed in corporate armor today, just simple black pants and a cream blouse, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look younger, more approachable. She held 2 paper cups of coffee and extended one to him without a word. They walked through the building in silence. Ethan glimpsed rooms filled with children's artwork, counseling offices with comfortable couches, a small library with beanbag chairs and picture books. The Whitmore Foundation, Victoria explained eventually, was a non-profit organization supporting children who'd lost parents. She'd founded it 11 years ago, quietly, without press releases or fundraising galas. Her name wasn't even on the building. They ended up in a small office on the 2nd floor, walls covered with photographs of children at various ages. Victoria sat in an armchair by the window, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, her eyes fixed on something Ethan couldn't see. He took the chair across from her and waited. 19 years ago, Victoria began. I was 30 years old and terrified. Her voice was steady, but her grip on the coffee cup tightened. I'd just taken over my father's company after he died suddenly. Heart attack at his desk, which should have been a warning I ignored. The board didn't trust me. The shareholders didn't trust me. I had to prove myself every single day just to survive. She paused. I also had a 2-year-old son named Henry. Ethan said nothing. He watched Victoria's face, saw the way her expression shifted as memories surfaced. Old pain, carefully contained, but never fully healed. My husband left when Henry was 6 months old. He couldn't handle the pressure, the scrutiny, the fact that I was about to become the most visible businesswoman in the country. I don't blame him anymore. I blamed him for a long time. But now I understand. Some people aren't built for that kind of life. She took a sip of coffee. Her hand wasn't trembling today. So there I was. New CEO, single mother, trying to hold together an empire while raising a toddler who didn't understand why mommy was never home. I hired nannies, the best nannies money could buy. I told myself Henry was fine, the children were resilient, that what I was building would benefit him in the long run. Then what happened? Ethan asked, though he already sensed the shape of the answer. Victoria set her coffee cup on the small table between them. Her eyes finally met his. He stopped talking. Not completely. He'd say a few words here and there, but he withdrew. The nannies reported that he spent hours alone in his room, staring out the window, waiting for something, for someone. Her voice dropped. For me. She stood and walked to the window, her back to Ethan. Outside, the garden was bright with morning sunlight. I ignored it. I told myself it was a phase. I had a board meeting in Tokyo, then a merger in London, then a crisis in Dubai. There was always something more urgent than my son's silence. Until the day the school called and told me Henry had tried to run away. He was 7 years old. He packed a backpack with snacks and a stuffed animal and walked 3 miles toward downtown before a police officer found him. Ethan's chest tightened. He thought about Lucy, about the nightmares, about the morning after Celia died, when she'd asked if he was going to disappear too. Where was he going? He asked. He didn't know, Victoria said. He just knew he wanted to find me. He wanted to show up at my office like the kids in movies, surprise me, make me pay attention to him. She turned around. Tears streamed down her face, silent and unashamed. My 7-year-old son loved me so much that he risked his life just to get a few minutes of my attention. And I wasn't there. I was in Singapore, signing papers that made me $50 million richer. The word Singapore hung between them. Ethan understood now. The interview question hadn't been random. It had been specific, deliberate, personal. Victoria had been testing him, testing whether he would make the same choice she had. What happened to Henry? Ethan asked. Victoria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that was surprisingly human, surprisingly ordinary. I flew home immediately, canceled everything, spent 3 months doing nothing but being his mother. Therapy, family counseling, learning how to actually be present instead of just physically existing in the same house. She laughed, but it was hollow. The board almost removed me. The shareholders called for my resignation. I lost 2 major deals because I refused to travel. Everyone said I was committing career suicide. But you didn't lose everything, Ethan observed. Victoria shook her head. No, I didn't. I lost some things. Contracts, relationships, the respect of people who didn't understand. But I kept my son. And over the years, I rebuilt. Slowly. Differently. She returned to her chair, sat down heavily. Henry is 21 now. He's in college, studying psychology. He wants to work with children who've experienced trauma. He's brilliant and kind, and he calls me every Sunday just to talk. Her voice broke slightly on the last word. I almost lost him, Mr. Miller. I almost lost him because I chose a business trip over being his mother. Ethan stared at the photographs on the walls. Children of all ages, some smiling, some solemn, all carrying invisible weights. So why did you reject me yesterday? He asked. If you understand what it means to choose family, why did you let your panel eliminate the one candidate who gave the answer you wish you'd given? Victoria was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was thick with something that might have been shame. Because I wasn't ready. Because for 20 years, I've built a company culture that rewards sacrifice and availability and loyalty that looks exactly like abandonment of everything else. Because when you said those words, my daughter only has me, I felt something I haven't felt in a long time. She met his eyes. I felt jealous that you had the courage I lacked at your age. The confession settled between them like dust after an earthquake. Ethan didn't know what to say. He'd come expecting explanations, maybe an apology, possibly a job offer wrapped in corporate conditions. He hadn't expected this. A billionaire crying in a non-profit office, admitting that she envied a broke single father because he'd done something she couldn't. The job, Ethan said slowly. You're not offering it back, are you? It wasn't a question. Victoria shook her head. No, not that job. That job requires someone willing to be on a plane at a moment's notice. That job requires someone willing to sacrifice exactly what you refuse to sacrifice. She paused. But I didn't bring you here to offer you that job. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, plain manila, unsealed. She handed it to Ethan without explanation. He opened it slowly. Inside was a document with the Whitmore Foundation letterhead, a job description. Program Director for Parent Support Services, salary, benefits, flexible hours, work from home options. Ethan read through it twice, his heart hammering against his ribs. This is real, he asked. It's real, Victoria confirmed. We've needed someone in this role for 2 years. Someone who understands what it means to be a parent alone. Someone who can look another struggling father or mother in the eye and say, "I've been there," without it being a lie. Ethan's hands shook as he held the folder. This wasn't charity. The role was legitimate, necessary, detailed. The salary was modest by corporate standards, but enough to pay rent and save for Lucy's future. The hours were designed for parents, not workaholic executives. "Why me?" he asked. "You could have hired anyone for this." Victoria smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. "Because of what you said in that conference room. Because you didn't hesitate. Because somewhere, someone needs to hear from a person who chose their child over their career and didn't regret it." She leaned forward. "I'm not asking you to be grateful, Mr. Miller. I'm asking you to help me undo some of the damage I did when I built a company that punishes people for being good parents." Ethan closed the folder. He thought about Lucy, about Celia's last word, about the promise he'd made at a grave that was now overgrown because he couldn't afford maintenance. He thought about the 4 years of rejections, the dwindling savings, the nights he'd sat in the dark, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake choosing his daughter over his career. "I'll need to think about it," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew what his answer would be. Victoria nodded. "Take all the time you need. The position isn't going anywhere." She paused. "And Mr. Miller? For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Not for rejecting you from the corporate job. You deserve better than that grind anyway. But for the way it was done. For letting you walk out believing no one valued what you'd sacrificed." 6 months later, Ethan sat in his new office at the Whitmore Foundation, surrounded by photographs of families he'd helped reconnect. The window overlooked the garden, now bright with summer flowers. His desk held a picture of Lucy, gap-toothed smile, purple backpack, waving at the camera on her first day of 2nd grade. Beside it was an older photo, faded and worn. Celia on their wedding day, laughing at something just outside the frame. The work was different than anything he'd done before. He ran support groups for single parents, connected families with resources, trained counselors to recognize the unique grief of children who'd lost mothers and fathers. He heard stories every day that echoed his own, men and women who'd chosen their children over advancement, who'd traded career success for presence, who'd been punished by a society that claimed to value families but rewarded their destruction. Some days were hard. Parents came to him broken and afraid, and all he could offer was the truth. It doesn't get easier, but you get stronger. The grief doesn't disappear, but you learn to carry it alongside the love. Your children won't remember the promotions you missed, but they'll remember every bedtime story you read them, every scraped knee you bandaged, every nightmare you sat through until morning. Lucy thrived. She still had nightmares sometimes, still asked questions about Mommy that Ethan couldn't fully answer. But she also laughed more, played more, invited friends over to their small apartment without shame. She told her teacher that her daddy was a helper. He helped other daddies and mommies who were sad. The teacher sent Ethan a note about it, and he kept it in his desk drawer alongside Celia's photograph. Victoria visited the foundation once a month, always unannounced. She'd walk through the building, chat with the staff, sometimes sit in on support group sessions as a silent observer. She and Ethan developed something that wasn't quite friendship, but was more than professional acquaintance. A mutual recognition of shared scars, shared regret, shared determination to do better. Henry came too sometimes. He was tall and quiet, and had his mother's eyes, sharp, observant, carrying depths that most people never saw. He was finishing his psychology degree and interning at the foundation twice a week, learning how to help children who'd experienced exactly what he'd experienced 20 years ago. One evening, after a particularly difficult session with a father whose wife had died 3 weeks earlier, Ethan stayed late at his desk. The building was quiet. The summer sun was setting outside his window, painting the garden in shades of gold and amber. He was staring at the photograph of Celia when Victoria knocked on his open door. She was dressed simply, as she always was at the foundation. No corporate armor, no power suits. She held 2 cups of tea and offered one to Ethan without a word. They sat in comfortable silence for a long moment. Then Victoria spoke. "Do you ever regret it? Saying what you said in that interview?" Ethan thought about the question. He thought about the months of rejection, the fear, the uncertainty. He thought about Lucy waving from the bus window. He thought about Celia's last word, spoken like a prayer. "No," he said finally. "Not for a single second." Victoria smiled. "Good. Neither do I." She sipped her tea. "You know, Henry asked me something last week. He asked if I ever wished I'd made different choices when he was young. If I ever wished I'd been more like the parents who put their careers first and ended up wealthy and successful and alone." Ethan waited. Victoria's expression grew soft, contemplative. I told him the truth. I told him I did make wrong choices. For years. I told him I hurt him in ways that still echo in both of us. But I also told him that my greatest success wasn't the company or the money or anything the world considers achievement. She looked at Ethan. "My greatest success was the moment I chose him. The moment I got on that plane and flew home and decided that being his mother mattered more than being everyone's CEO." Ethan understood. He understood in a way that didn't require words. Outside, the sun slipped below the horizon, and the garden fell into gentle shadow. Somewhere across the city, Lucy was at a sleepover with her best friend, and for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel the low hum of anxiety about being away from her. She was growing up. She was becoming herself, and she was doing it knowing, with absolute certainty, that her father would always choose her. The Whitmore Foundation would publish its annual report the following month. The numbers would show families helped, children supported, resources distributed. But the numbers wouldn't capture what Ethan saw every day. The moment a parent realized they weren't alone, the moment a child understood that grief didn't mean the end of love. Those moments couldn't be quantified. They could only be lived. Ethan finished his tea and looked at the photograph of Celia one more time. He liked to imagine she could see him now, not the successful executive she'd married, but the man he'd become after losing her. The man who'd chosen Lucy over everything and discovered that everything was exactly what he'd found. The world still didn't understand. There would always be interviews with questions designed to eliminate parents, jobs that demanded sacrifice of family for profit, systems built by people who'd never had to choose between a child's hand and a corner office. But there were also places like this foundation, people like Victoria, who'd learned too late and were trying to teach others before they made the same mistakes. Children like Henry, who'd grown up wounded but not broken, determined to help others heal. And there were fathers, like Ethan. Fathers who'd failed interviews and walked away, only to discover that walking away was the bravest thing they'd ever done. Not because it led to a better job, or more money, or any of the metrics the world used to measure worth, but because it led them home, to their children, to themselves, to a kind of success that couldn't be earned in conference rooms or calculated in quarterly reports. Ethan Miller had failed the interview, and in failing, he had finally won. 3 years after that first meeting at the foundation, Lucy turned 9. Ethan threw her a birthday party in the garden, the same garden he'd seen from his office window hundreds of times, now decorated with balloons and streamers in purple, her favorite color. Victoria came, and Henry, and a dozen other families from the foundation who'd become something like an extended family. Lucy blew out her candles and made a wish she wouldn't tell anyone. But later, when the other children were playing and the adults were talking, she found Ethan sitting alone on a bench near the roses. She climbed up next to him and leaned her head against his shoulder. "Daddy," she said quietly, "I know what I wished for." Ethan wrapped his arm around her, feeling her warmth against his side. "I thought wishes were supposed to be secret." Lucy shook her head. "This one already came true, so I can tell." She looked up at him with eyes that held echoes of Celia. The same shape, the same depth, the same capacity for love that had broken his heart and rebuilt it stronger. "I wished that you'd always be there when I get off the bus. And you always are." Ethan couldn't speak for a moment. The weight of her words settled into his chest, alongside the grief and the gratitude, and the fierce, protective love that had guided every decision he'd made since Celia's death. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the scent of birthday cake and childhood. "Always," he promised. "No matter what." And he meant it. Not as a fantasy or an aspiration, but as truth, earned through sacrifice, tested by rejection, proven in 1,000 small moments of showing up when it would have been easier to chase something the world called success. Lucy smiled and ran off to rejoin her friends, her laughter echoing across the garden like music. Ethan watched her go, his heart full of something that had no name but felt like completion. The sun was setting now, painting everything in shades of gold, and somewhere in the distance, a bird was singing. He thought of Celia. He thought of the conference room where he'd spoken 4 words that changed everything. He thought of Victoria running toward him, her heels striking marble like gunshots. Some people spend their whole lives chasing achievements that turn to dust in their hands. Others discover that the greatest achievement is simply being present. Fully, completely, unreservedly present for the people who need them most. Ethan Miller had learned that lesson the hard way. But he'd learned it. And every morning, when he watched Lucy wave from the bus window, every evening when she ran into his arms after school, every night when he tucked her in and told her stories about her mother, he knew that the 4-second answer that ended his interview had been the beginning of everything that mattered.